Russia and Ukraine will hold third round of peace talks on Monday, Kyiv claims. But Moscow says discussions could take place in the coming days, the Daily Mail reports. Ukrainian negotiator David Arakhamia announced the talks in a Facebook post. The Russian side was less definitive, saying the talks might be held Monday. Since the war began, Ukraine and Russia have held 2 rounds of talks. The last round saw an agreement for humanitarian corridors to be opened. However, Ukraine today accused Russia of not adhering to a ceasefire to allow thousands of citizens to flee Mariupol and Volnovakha. Russia blamed Ukraine. The Russian side was less definitive, though, saying merely that the talks might start on Monday. Delegations from Ukraine and Russia have held 2 rounds of talks since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of its neighbor on February 24. On Thursday, the sides agreed to open humanitarian corridors to allow civilians out of some combat zones, although there have been delays in implementing them after Ukraine accused Russia of not upholding the ceasefire. Ukraine said on Saturday the talks had not produced results, but that it would keep pursuing negotiations. Meanwhile, Israel's premier stepped into the role of mediator as Russia's invasion of Ukraine intensified, holding a 3-hour meeting at the Kremlin with Vladimir Putin before calling Ukraine's president and flying to Berlin. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's sit-down with Putin was the first by foreign leader since the day Russian forces invaded Ukraine last week, and came after Kyiv had asked Israel to launch a dialogue with Moscow. The third round of talks will take place on Monday, according to Arakhamia, who is also the parliamentary faction leader of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's party. Russian news agency Interfax later quoted Russian negotiator Leonid Slutsky as saying the third round really could take place in the coming days. It's possible it will be on Monday. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Saturday that Zelenskyy's attempt to secure direct NATO help in the conflict between their countries was not helping talks between the two sides, but that Moscow was ready for a third round. Wary of being dragged into Moscow's war on its neighbor, NATO on Friday turned down Zelenskyy's appeal to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This prompted the Ukrainian president to say that the alliance had given Russia the green light to continue its bombing campaign. Earlier on Saturday, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said he was open to talks with Lavrov, but only if they were meaningful. The Kremlin said on Friday that progress in the negotiations would depend on Kyiv's reaction to Moscow's position on how to end the war, which had been conveyed to Ukraine on Thursday. Russia's TASS news agency quoted Slutsky as saying the Ukrainian side had shown some openness in the second round to reaching an agreement. News of the third round of talks came as UK said Russia's proposed ceasefire in the Ukraine city of Mariupol was probably an attempt to deflect international condemnation while giving itself a chance to reset its forces for a renewed offensive. In an intelligence update on Saturday afternoon, the ministry said, by accusing Ukraine of breaking the agreement, Russia is likely seeking to shift responsibility for current and future civilian casualties in the city. Russia said earlier it had opened humanitarian corridors near the besieged cities of Mariupol and Volnovakha. Russia's defense ministry then accused Ukrainian nationalists of preventing civilians from leaving, RIA news agency reported. But Mariupol City Council said Russia was not observing the ceasefire. Also today, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Western sanctions were akin to war as his forces pressed their assault on Ukraine on Saturday for a 10th day, and the IMF warned that the conflict would have a severe impact on the global economy. Moscow and Kyiv traded blame over the failure of plans to impose a brief ceasefire and enable civilians to evacuate 2 cities besieged by Russian forces. Russia's invasion has already driven nearly 1.5 million refugees westwards into the European Union. Putin said he wanted a neutral Ukraine that had been demilitarized and denazified, adding, "These sanctions that are being imposed are akin to a declaration of war, but thank God it has not come to that." Ukraine and Western countries have rejected Putin's arguments as a baseless pretext for invading and have sought to squeeze Russia hard with sanctions. The International Committee of the Red Cross said planned civilian evacuations from Mariupol and Volnovakha were now unlikely to start on Saturday. The port of Mariupol has endured heavy bombardment, a sign of its strategic value to Moscow due to its position between Russian-backed separatist-held eastern Ukraine and the Black Sea Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow seized from Kyiv in 2014. Russia's defense ministry said its forces were carrying out a wide-ranging offensive in Ukraine and had taken several towns and villages, Interfax news agency reported. In an aerial combat near Zhytomyr, about 62 miles west of Kyiv, it said 4 Ukrainian Su-27 fighter jets had been shot down. Reuters could not independently confirm the report. A United Nations monitoring mission said at least 351 civilians had been confirmed killed and 707 injured in Ukraine so far since the start of the invasion on February 24, adding that the real figures were likely to be considerably higher. The number of refugees could rise to 1.5 million by Sunday night from 1.3 million now, the UN Refugee Agency chief said. Women and children, often number with exhaustion, continued to pour into Poland and other neighboring countries, as well as into western Ukrainian cities such as Lviv. "I've barely slept for 10 days, said Anna Filatova, arriving in Lviv with her 2 daughters from heavily bombed Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city near its eastern border with Russia. The Russians want to flatten Kharkiv. We hate Putin." U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, on a visit to Poland, met refugees staying in a disused shopping mall near the border. Poland has taken in the vast majority of the Ukrainian refugees. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's sit-down with Putin was the first by foreign leaders since the day Russian forces invaded Ukraine last week, and came after Kyiv had asked Israel to launch a dialogue with Moscow. Bennett has so far walked a very cautious line on the Ukraine crisis, seeking to preserve delicate security cooperation with Russia, which has a large military presence in Israel's northern neighbor Syria. Bennett has not joined Western leaders, notably key ally the United States, in forcefully condemning the invasion, instead stressing Israel's strong relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Ahead of his Moscow trip, Bennett had spoken by telephone repeatedly with both Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Bennett's office said he left Israel for Moscow early Saturday, itself an extraordinary move for a religious Jew who does not conduct state business on the Jewish Shabbat, except in extraordinary circumstances. Bennett and Putin met for 3 hours, in a visit that was coordinated with the U.S., Germany, and France, an Israeli official said. Bennett's delegation included his housing minister, fluent Russian speaker Zeev Elkin, who was born in Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union. The Kremlin said different aspects of the situation in Ukraine were discussed during the short working visit. After the Putin meeting, Bennett called Zelenskyy, who is Jewish, has family in Israel, and has visited the country many times. Bennett then headed to Germany for talks with Chancellor Olaf Scholz scheduled for late Saturday. A statement from the French presidency said that Emmanuel Macron also spoke to Bennett before he left for Moscow on Saturday as part of joint efforts to obtain a ceasefire in Ukraine.
Attention business owners. Let me ask you something. What if I told you that your website have its own chat support staff for 24/7 and interact with your site visitors and get their questions answered? Or help you generate more sales on many websites as you wish for small one-time fee? And what if I told you that you can do all these without hiring staff, virtual agents, and sophisticated platforms? Do you want to know more about this cutting-edge software? Click the link on the description section below.